Let's talk about Ronald Reagan, the 40th U.S. president. Now here's a figure who didn't just occupy the White House, he fundamentally reshaped American politics. His journey from Hollywood actor to one of the most consequential leaders of the 20th century is this incredible story of change. And honestly, his legacy is still debated just as fiercely today as it was when he left office.
And that really raises the central question for us, doesn't it? How on earth did a Hollywood actor manage to become one of the most transformative presidents of the modern era?
To really get a handle on Reagan, you have to start with this one sentence from his first inaugural address. This wasn't just some catchy line for a speech, it was the absolute core philosophy that would drive his entire presidency and really ignite a conservative revolution in America.
But way before he was this political heavyweight, Reagan was a household name for a totally different reason. You see, his path to power didn't start in Washington, D.C. It began on the airwaves and the silver screens of America.
You can see his public career just built up step by step. He starts out as a radio broadcaster in Iowa, then, boom, 1937, he lands a Hollywood contract. His role as the Gipper gave him a nickname that stuck with him forever, and by the 1950s, he was this familiar, friendly face on TV, all the while honing those communication skills that would later become his political superpower.
And you know, his time as president of the Screen Actors Guild, that was basically his political boot camp. This was no walk in the park. He was right in the thick of it, navigating intense labor negotiations and the whole controversy around the Hollywood blacklist, where people were denied work if they were suspected of being communists. He even testified before Congress. This is where he really learned to negotiate and to lead.
Now, that experience in Hollywood, it also happened right as another huge shift was going on, and this one was personal. It was Reagan's own political transformation, from a liberal Democrat into the standard-bearer for American conservatism. This might surprise you, but early in his career, Reagan was a die-hard Democrat. He deeply admired Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, even calling FDR a true hero, which is a wild contrast to the conservative icon he would later become.
And you can really see the shift happen over time. He was all in for Democrat Harry Truman back in '48. But by the 50s, you can see him starting to lean the other way, backing Republicans like Eisenhower and Nixon. And this was years before he officially switched parties in 1962.
But the moment that really launched him into the conservative stratosphere, that was this 1964 televised speech for presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. It became known as A Time for Choosing, and his powerful, clear message just electrified viewers. And bam, put him on the national political map.
After that speech, his political rise was just methodical. First, the speech makes him a conservative star. Then, just 2 years later, he wins the governorship of California in a landslide. He serves 2 terms there, and by 1980, he pulls off another landslide victory to become President of the United States. So he gets to the White House, and right away, he sets his sights on a struggling economy. He came in with a bold and, pretty controversial new approach that everyone soon started calling Reaganomics. So, what exactly was Reaganomics? Well, at its heart, it was all about something called supply-side economics. The basic idea was this: if you cut taxes, especially for big corporations and the wealthy, and you slash government regulations, you'll encourage businesses to invest more. That investment, in theory, creates more jobs and prosperity that would eventually, as his critics called it, trickle down to everyone else.
And his supporters will point to numbers just like this as proof that, hey, it worked. After a really tough recession early in his first term, you can see that both inflation and unemployment started a steady decline. It kicked off one of the longest periods of peacetime economic growth in American history.
But, and this is a big but, that growth came at a staggering price. The combination of those deep tax cuts and a massive increase in military spending created huge budget deficits. The result? The national debt nearly tripled, exploding from just under $1 trillion to almost $3 trillion by the time he left office.
Okay, so besides the economy, the other defining issue of his presidency was, of course, the Cold War. And his approach here, while it also saw this really dramatic transformation, from a hardline anti-communist to a diplomat who helped bring the whole conflict to a peaceful end.
When he first came into office, Reagan's language was, let's just say, aggressive. He'd completely tossed out the previous policy of détente, which was all about easing tensions. Instead, he framed the Cold War in these stark moral terms, famously labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire.
And believe me, this wasn't just talk. The Reagan doctrine backed it up with that massive increase in defense spending we mentioned. It also meant directly supporting anti-communist freedom fighters in places like Afghanistan and Nicaragua, all in an effort to roll back Soviet influence across the globe.
But then something unexpected happened. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union, and Reagan sees an opening. He just pivots, completely shifts from confrontation to diplomacy, and he engages in this series of historic summits. He ended up developing a surprising personal connection with Gorbachev, which really changed the entire dynamic of the Cold War.
And that whole pivot really led to one of the most iconic moments of his entire presidency. There he is, standing at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, this stark symbol of a divided world, and he issues a direct, powerful challenge that would just echo through history.
And what's so important to remember is that this diplomacy led to real, tangible results. I mean, the INF Treaty was a huge deal. For the first time ever, the two superpowers didn't just agree to limit their nuclear weapons, they agreed to completely eliminate an entire class of them. It was a massive step in de-escalating the arms race.
So how do you balance it all? The economic boom versus the debt, the hardliner versus the diplomat. Decades later, Reagan's legacy is still one of the most complex and fiercely debated in all of American history.
I mean, the contradictions of his legacy they're stark. On one hand, people praise him for bringing back American optimism and for his role in ending the Cold War. But on the other hand, he gets heavily criticized for that ballooning national debt, for the Iran-Contra affair, which was this secret arms for hostages deal, and for his administration's very slow initial response to the AIDS crisis.
And it's fascinating to see how his reputation among historians has changed over time. Right after he left office, he was often ranked somewhere in the middle of the pack, in the 20s. But fast forward a couple of decades and his standing has steadily climbed, with many now placing him firmly in the top 10 U.S. presidents.
And that really brings us to the ultimate question of his legacy. Was Ronald Reagan this singular force who actually bent the arc of history himself? Or was he more of a product of his time, a brilliant communicator who just perfectly rode a conservative wave that was already building? Answering that is exactly why his presidency will continue to be studied and debated for generations to come.